I was 25 the summer I decided to camp alone in the mountains of Colorado. It was late July of 2014. The heat in town had been unbearable, and I wanted nothing more than to escape into the quiet of the high country. I'd been camping many times before, always with friends or family, but that trip was the first time I went completely by myself. I thought it would be peaceful, a way to clear my head. I drove my old silver Toyota up a dirt road that wound through thick pine forests. The higher I climbed, the cooler the air felt. The trees were tall and crowded together, the kind of woods that always seemed darker than they should, even during the day. I remember rolling down the window, breathing in the strong pine smell mixed with dust from the road. I found a small clearing next to a creek, far enough off the road that I wouldn't see anyone unless they came looking. It seemed perfect. There was a flat patch of ground for my tent, the water nearby for washing up, and plenty of firewood scattered around. I set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked some dry branches for later. As the sun lowered behind the ridges, the air dropped fast. Nights in the mountains always felt colder than I expected. I built a fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat by the flames while the woods around me grew darker. The creek made a steady rushing sound that filled the silence, and now and then I could hear a bird or the snap of a branch deep in the trees. At first, I loved the quiet. It felt different being alone, almost cleaner, like nothing from the outside world could touch me. But after the fire burned down low, the quiet began to press on me in another way. The dark seemed heavier. Every sound felt sharper. A stick breaking in the woods made me sit up straight. The longer I stared into the dark, the more I felt like something was staring back. I finally crawled into my tent around 10. I zipped the flap shut, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to let the sound of the creek lull me to sleep. But my body wouldn't relax. My ears kept searching the night. I could hear the wind in the trees, small things moving in the brush, and once or twice the far-off call of what might have been a coyote. It was past midnight when I heard the first sound that froze me. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the creek. It was the crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles. Slow, heavy steps, too measured to be a deer. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps came closer, circling, then stopping. I didn't move. I lay stiff in my sleeping bag, my hand gripping the small flashlight I'd kept by my side. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, I couldn't tell. The sound faded, like whoever it was had moved back into the woods. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that maybe a tree branch had fallen or something, but deep down I knew. I stayed awake for hours, ears wide open, staring at the faint outline of the tent roof above me. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into shallow sleep. I woke again to the sound of movement, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was the faint metallic clink of something brushing against metal. My cooler. I had left it outside, latched shut beside the fire pit. I slowly unzipped the tent just a few inches, enough to peek out. The moon was bright enough to light the clearing. My cooler had been dragged several feet. The latch was open, and standing a short distance away was a man. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. He wore a dirty brown jacket even though the night wasn't freezing, and his pants looked ripped at the knees. He had a shaggy beard, and his hair was greasy, hanging down over his face. He was crouched low, rummaging through my food with his hands. My stomach turned cold. It wasn't just the fact that he was there. It was how quiet he was, how deliberate. He didn't stumble onto my camp by accident. He had been watching. I pulled the zipper back down, careful not to make a sound. My mind raced. I didn't have a gun, only a hatchet I'd used to chop firewood. My car was parked 20 yards away, but the keys were inside my backpack, sitting out near the fire pit. To get to them, I'd have to leave the tent. The man moved around my camp for what felt like forever. I could hear him opening bags, shifting through gear, breathing heavy. At one point, I heard the sound of fabric tearing, like he'd cut something open. My throat was dry, my palms sweating. Every nerve in my body screamed to do something, but I was frozen. I stayed curled inside the tent, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the noises stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The only sound was the creak again. When I finally unzipped the tent, the clearing looked empty. My cooler was tipped on its side, food scattered across the dirt. My backpack was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up until dawn, gripping the hatchet with both hands, eyes fixed on the flap. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every creak of the trees sounded like someone moving. When the first light touched the tops of the trees, I stuffed what little I had left into the car. My stomach was tight, my whole body shaky, but I kept moving. As I was packing, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the creek. Big boot prints, leading in and out of the trees. They weren't mine. They led deeper into the forest, in the opposite direction of the road. The drive down the mountain felt longer than the drive up. Every corner, every patch of woods, I expected to see that man step out. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people, the noise of traffic filling the air. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel. I thought I'd sleep better with four walls around me, but I barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape of that man crouched by my camp, his hands digging through my food like he owned it, like he'd been there waiting. I never went camping alone again. Even when I go with friends now, I find myself scanning the tree line every few minutes, listening too closely to every sound. I don't tell the story much because people always ask the same thing. Why didn't I get out? Why didn't I yell? Why didn't I fight back? The truth is, you don't know what you'll do until you're out there, cut off from everyone, realizing the only thing between you and a stranger in the woods is a thin sheet of nylon. And the part that still unsettles me most is this: he didn't take much, just some food and my backpack. He could have taken more. He could have taken everything, but he didn't. He left, which means he chose to. And that thought alone keeps me awake some nights, long after I've blown out the lantern and zipped the door shut. I was 24 when I took a long trip through Europe, and by late summer of 2018, I found myself in Austria. I had been bouncing from one city to another, staying mostly in cheap hostels, but after weeks of crowded dorm rooms and constant noise, I wanted some quiet. I had brought along a small tent and some basic camping gear, so I decided to camp for a few nights in the Austrian countryside, away from people and traffic. I picked a spot outside a small village not too far from Salzburg, near a stretch of woods that looked calm and untouched. The area was beautiful: rolling hills, scattered patches of forest, and small dirt trails that felt almost hidden. I hiked a good way in before finding a clearing where the grass was flat enough to pitch my tent. There was no official campground here. It was just land, quiet and open. I set up near the edge of the trees where I had some cover but could still see the night sky. My plan was to stay 2 nights before moving back toward civilization. The first day was peaceful. I walked around, cooked some simple food over a small camping stove, and sat back watching the sky darken over the hills. The evening air was cool, with the faint smell of pine drifting from the forest. It was exactly the break I wanted: no cars, no chatter, no rush, just silence. When the night settled in, I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent and let the sound of crickets carry me to sleep. But that night didn't stay quiet for long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first I thought it was because of the cold, but then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just faint movement outside, like someone stepping carefully in the grass. My first thought was that it could be a deer or maybe some other animal passing by. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound would come for a few seconds, then stop, then start again, slow and steady. It wasn't heavy enough to sound like a large animal, but it also didn't feel random. It sounded like steps, human steps. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just my head playing tricks, but the longer I listened, the more sure I became that someone was out there. I lay frozen inside my tent, staring at the fabric wall, every sense sharpened. The footsteps eventually faded, but by then my nerves were raw. I barely slept again, drifting in and out until the morning light finally came. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked the same as before. No sign of anyone. The ground was too grassy to show clear prints, and I tried to tell myself it had been nothing, maybe an animal after all. I shook it off, made some breakfast, and went for a walk along a dirt path leading deeper into the trees. That day passed quietly. I read a book I had carried with me, explored a bit of the forest, and took some photos. I didn't see anyone the entire day. By the time the sun started setting, I was calmer, telling myself I had just been spooked for no reason. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to the same faint sound, movement outside the tent. This time, I didn't just lie there. I slowly reached for the small flashlight I kept beside me and switched it on. The beam lit up the thin fabric of the tent walls, casting pale light in every direction. I listened hard. The footsteps stopped again, like whoever or whatever it was had frozen too. My chest tightened. I waited a few minutes, gripping the flashlight, my ears straining. The air felt heavier than before. When I couldn't take it anymore, I unzipped the tent flap just a little and shined the light outside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the empty clearing. I moved the beam slowly, my hand shaking slightly, until I caught something at the far edge of the clearing. A man was standing there. He was maybe 30 or 40 feet away, just at the edge where the clearing met the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing still, looking directly toward my tent. The flashlight caught his face for only a moment, but it was enough. He looked like an older man, maybe in his 50s, his hair thin and gray. His clothes were plain, a dark jacket, pants that looked a little too loose. His posture was stiff, his arms hanging by his sides. The instant my light hit him, I froze. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, he turned slowly and walked back into the trees until he disappeared into the dark. I sat there in my tent for the rest of the night, not daring to move. Every sound made my skin crawl, and I couldn't close my eyes. I thought about packing up right then, but I didn't want to step out into the open where I had seen him. I waited until the sky started to lighten before I finally packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands shook while I tore down the tent, and I kept glancing at the tree line. The hike back toward the village felt like it took forever. My ears picked up every sound, every twig snapping, every rustle in the brush. I didn't see him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trails seemed more confusing than before, like I was moving too slow. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, steady and measured, but when I stopped and looked back, the woods were empty. When I finally reached the road that led back to the village, I felt a weight lift off me. Cars passed occasionally, and the sight of other people in the distance was almost overwhelming. I walked straight into the village, found a small guest house, and paid for a room without a second thought. Lying in that bed, surrounded by 4 solid walls, I thought back on what happened. There was no question about what I had seen. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't an animal, it wasn't in my head. A man had been standing at the edge of my campsite, watching me in silence. Twice. He hadn't said anything, hadn't approached, but he had been there. I kept thinking about his face, the way he hadn't flinched when I pointed the light at him, the way he just turned and walked back into the dark like he belonged there. I didn't know if he was a local, maybe someone living off in those woods, or if he was something worse, someone who waited for campers to come out there alone. I'll never know, because I didn't stay another night to find out. After that, I stopped camping by myself for the rest of the trip. I stuck to hostels and cheap rooms, even if they were noisy. The quiet didn't seem so appealing anymore. It's been years since then, but I can still picture that clearing in Austria, the cold air against my face, and that man standing there just beyond the trees. Sometimes when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned the flashlight on. Would he have kept standing there, watching me until morning? Or would he have come closer, step by step, until I woke to the sound of him right outside my tent? I don't go camping alone anymore. I had decided to camp on my uncle's farm in Kansas during the late summer of 2011. I was 21 back then, old enough to not be afraid of the dark, but still curious enough to chase the kind of quiet that only farmland could give. The farm sat on the edge of a wide, flat plain that stretched for miles in every direction. Most of the land was cornfields broken up by a few patches of soybeans and scattered tree lines. There was a half-collapsed barn near the back of the property, and an old windmill that didn't spin anymore. My uncle hadn't lived there in years, but he kept the land, renting parts of it out and leaving the rest to sit in silence. The plan was simple. I'd drive out late in the afternoon, set up a tent near the far corner of the fields, and stay overnight alone. I wanted that heavy silence, the kind where every sound feels amplified and sharp. It wasn't about bravery or testing myself. I just wanted to be somewhere far from the constant noise of town. The air that day was hot and sticky, one of those late August days where the sky looks washed out and pale blue. Dust clung to the back of my throat as I drove down the long dirt road leading to the farm. The fields were tall and green, the corn stalks standing shoulder to shoulder like a wall. I parked near the tree line, loaded my gear on my back, and walked about half a mile toward a small clearing near the edge of a soybean field. The spot felt isolated but not claustrophobic, open enough that I could see the sky but tucked in just enough that the trees shielded me from the wind. I pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire ring with dry branches I gathered along the tree line. By the time the sun started to dip low, I had everything ready. The air changed as it got darker. The sound of insects thickened. A steady, high-pitched hum mixed with the low croak of frogs from somewhere farther out. The smell of dirt and cut grass hung heavy, and every so often the cornfield hissed as the wind pushed through the stalks. As night settled, I sat by the fire with a small flashlight and a thermos of water. The silence pressed harder now. Out in the country, away from everything, the kind of silence you get isn't empty. It's layered. You notice the smallest crack of a twig, the faint rustle of leaves. Every sound feels like it's directed at you. First, it was peaceful. I watched the flames eat through the sticks, sparks rising into the dark. The air cooled down and I pulled my jacket tighter. But then the noises started to feel different. I heard something moving in the corn. It wasn't the constant sway of the stalks in the wind. It was slower, heavier, like something was brushing through them carefully. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I froze, holding the flashlight, trying to catch the shape of whatever it was. I told myself it was just a deer. The land was full of them, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized it didn't sound like an animal at all. It was steady, almost deliberate, the way the stalks parted. I turned the flashlight toward the field, sweeping the beam across the green wall of corn. The light bounced off the leaves, but I saw nothing. The sound stopped again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I let out a slow breath and tried to focus on the fire. After a few minutes, the noise didn't come back, and I told myself I was imagining it. Around midnight, I decided to crawl into the tent. The fire had burned low, just glowing coals now. I zipped up the flap, laid on my back, and tried to settle into the sleeping bag. The insects outside still droned, and the wind pushed softly through the trees. But then I heard it again. That same noise, stalks being brushed aside, one by one. This time it was closer, much closer. It wasn't random rustling. It was moving in a line, edging along the field, like someone was pacing just out of sight. My skin went cold. I held my breath and listened, counting the slow steps in my head. Then it stopped and everything went too quiet. The insects, the frogs, they all seemed to fade. The silence pressed so hard against the tent walls it felt like the air was holding its breath with me. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. My hand was tight around the flashlight, ready to switch it on, but I didn't want to move. I was convinced that if I made noise, whatever it was would hear me. Finally, exhaustion mixed with fear, and I must have drifted in and out of sleep. I woke to a soft crunch. Not in the field this time, on the dirt, just outside the tent. Slow steps pressing into the soil. I didn't move. My throat went dry, and every muscle in my body tensed. The steps circled once, then stopped at the back corner of the tent. I stared hard at the fabric, waiting for a shadow, a shape, anything. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. Minutes crawled by. I didn't hear the steps leave. At some point, I must have passed out again, because the next thing I knew, gray light was seeping through the tent fabric. Dawn had come. When I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, the air was cool and damp with morning dew. The first thing I did was scan the dirt around the tent. That's when I saw them, prints, clear as day. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The dirt showed the outline of toes, the heel pressed deep, as if whoever it was had been walking slowly, carefully. The tracks circled the tent once, then led back into the cornfield. The fire was completely dead, just ash and blackened wood. My stomach twisted. The nearest house was almost 2 miles away, and nobody had any reason to be out there barefoot in the middle of the night. I packed everything up in a rush, stuffing the sleeping bag and tent without folding them properly. My hands shook as I shoved the gear into the trunk of the car. Driving back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the field watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, the endless rows of corn shrinking in the distance. I never went back to camp on that farm again. I don't know who it was or why they were out there in the fields in the middle of the night with no shoes, circling my tent like that. Maybe they were watching me for hours. Maybe they were waiting for something. All I know is that someone was there, moving in the dark, close enough to touch the thin fabric that separated us. That's the part that stuck with me the most. Not knowing if they stood there while I slept, listening to me breathe, deciding what to do next. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. It was late summer of 2012, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city. I was 26 at the time, single and restless, and the idea of being alone in the woods sounded like the perfect reset. I drove out of Ohio down into West Virginia, aiming for the Monongahela National Forest. I had read that the forest was quieter than the big national parks and not as crowded. That's exactly what I was after. Quiet, no interruptions, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. The day I left was hot. The sun sat heavy in the sky, and the asphalt shimmered. My car was packed with a cheap 2-man tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and water, a folding chair, and my old hunting knife that I had owned since college. I wasn't going hunting, but carrying it gave me some peace of mind. I had also thrown in a flashlight, spare batteries, a small hatchet for firewood, and a first aid kit. Everything seemed in order. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was already dropping behind the ridges. The drive into the woods took longer than I expected because the gravel roads wound tightly, with steep drops to one side and dense pines on the other. The trees rose so tall that they blocked out most of the sky. The place felt older than anything I was used to. The deeper I went, the less I saw of people. The occasional truck pulled over on the side of the road was the only reminder I wasn't the only person out there. I eventually found a clearing about 100 yards off the gravel road. A faint trail led in, just wide enough to drag my gear through. The spot was flat, surrounded by thick brush on three sides, with a break in the trees that opened to a small stream. I set up camp there. The ground was soft with pine needles, and it smelled of damp earth. I pitched my tent, stacked wood for the fire, and cracked open a beer. The quiet was heavier than I expected. At first, it was peaceful, just crickets, the faint trickle of the stream, and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. But once the sun went down, the silence felt different. Every sound carried sharper. A snapping twig in the distance felt close. The shadows between the trees looked thicker than they should. I lit the fire and cooked a couple of hot dogs on a stick. The flames danced, throwing light across the trees, but beyond the circle of fire, everything fell into blackness. I thought I heard movement once, something crunching slowly in the leaves. I froze and listened, but the sound stopped just as I noticed it. I told myself it was a deer. Around midnight, I crawled into the tent. I had left the fire burning low, just embers glowing red. I unrolled my sleeping bag and lay down. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper thin. I could hear every chirp, every groan of the trees. Sometime after lying there with my eyes closed, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. Not the quick scurry of a raccoon or the heavy crash of a bear. Human-like. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, then nothing. My body went stiff. My hand moved slowly toward the knife I had kept beside me. I gripped it, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. I was too afraid to unzip the tent and look, so I just laid there, gripping the knife until my hand cramped. Eventually, I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep because I woke up to faint light filtering through the fabric. Morning brought some comfort. The forest didn't feel as threatening in daylight. I stepped outside, blinking at the sun, and checked the ground. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I did see impressions in the soft earth, not far from the tent. They weren't clear footprints, but the soil had been disturbed. Maybe it was my imagination, but it looked like someone had stood there. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The day went by quietly. I hiked along the stream, collected wood, and tried to relax. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the thought of those footsteps. By dusk, I felt uneasy again. I built the fire larger, trying to push the darkness back. The woods seemed to press closer as night fell. When I finally crawled into the tent again, I kept the knife closer and left the flashlight in my hand. The forest outside was alive with chirps and snaps. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that the woods always sounded like this. But then, just like the night before, I heard slow steps again, leaves crunching, branches pushing aside. This time, it didn't stop outside the tent. It circled. I could hear it moving around me, one careful step at a time. My chest tightened, and I held the knife so tight my knuckles hurt. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the tent fabric. A finger? A hand? The thin nylon shifted slightly, like something traced along it. I wanted to shout, to scare whoever it was away, but fear pinned me in place. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving my gear into the car without caring how it fit. As I was rolling up the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt, right where I had heard the brushing sound, was a footprint, clear as day, barefoot, human, driving out of the forest. I kept checking my rearview mirror. The woods looked normal in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even following me. When I finally hit the main highway, I pulled over at a gas station. My hands were still shaking. That was the last time I camped alone. I never reported it because I had no proof, and I figured no one would believe me anyway. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. There had been someone out there in those woods, moving around my camp, watching me in the dark. Maybe just some drifter, maybe someone worse. I'll never know. But every time I think about camping again, I remember standing there in the daylight, looking at that barefoot print in the soil. It reminded me that the forest wasn't empty like I wanted it to be. Someone had been there, just feet from where I slept, waiting in the dark. And the worst part is, I'll never know why. I was 29 when I drove out to the northern woods of Michigan in late October of 2004. The air had that sharp edge of fall, the kind that cut across your face when you stepped out of the truck. I had hunted before, but never this deep into the forest and never fully alone. I told myself it would just be a couple of nights, 3 at most. I wanted the peace, the silence, the challenge. The dirt road leading in had been narrow, overgrown on both sides, with branches tapping against the truck as I crawled down it. I stopped at a small clearing near the end of the track where the forest swallowed everything else. From there, it was just me, my pack, my rifle, and the cold. I set camp near a tree line where the woods bent down into a marshy stretch. It looked like a good place to catch deer crossing at dusk. I kept it simple. One small tent, a rolled-out sleeping bag, a fire pit dug into the ground. The woods were quiet except for a crow that circled overhead, its calls echoing far off. That first day went smoothly. I scouted a trail about half a mile from camp, spotted some fresh tracks in the soft dirt, and felt a rush of excitement. The sun slid down early that time of year, and by the time I got back to camp, the sky had turned a heavy gray. I built a small fire, cooked up a can of beans, and sat listening to the stillness settle. The kind of stillness where every snap of a twig sounds louder than it should. When night fully came, the dark was thick, pressing against the walls of the tent. The only light was the faint glow of the fire dying down outside. I lay in my bag, staring at the nylon above me, hearing the small pops and cracks of branches shifting in the cold. At one point, I heard something heavier move through the brush. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, maybe nothing at all. Sleep eventually pulled me under. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. The air damp and bitter cold. Frost crusted the grass. My breath rose in white clouds as I headed toward the trail with my rifle slung over my shoulder. The woods were darker than I expected. Even after the sun broke the horizon, the trees blocked most of the light, keeping everything dim. I tracked for hours, spotting prints, pausing to listen, but never catching sight of anything bigger than a squirrel. At one point, I realized I had walked farther than planned. My camp was nowhere in sight, and the silence around me had grown heavier. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves. That's when I noticed the other prints. They weren't deer. They weren't boots like mine either. They looked like worn shoes, edges uneven, dragging slightly as if whoever made them was limping. They crossed the same deer trail I'd been following. My chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to be a place people wandered into. The closest house had to be 10 miles away. I stood there, staring down at those faint tracks in the mud, debating whether to follow them or turn back. I told myself it was nothing, probably an old hunter's trail from weeks ago. Still, the edges of those prints looked fresh, not dried out. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nerves. I didn't see a single deer. Every time the wind shifted, I felt watched. By mid-afternoon, I made my way back toward camp, stopping often to glance behind me. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. When I reached camp, the fire pit looked disturbed. Not a lot, just a little. Ash scattered like someone had stepped too close. I told myself it could have been the wind, though the air had been still all day. My stomach felt knotted, but I forced myself to get the fire going again and cooked some jerky. As the light drained, the forest grew darker faster than the night before. That night, lying in the tent, I couldn't sleep. The silence outside was broken once by what sounded like careful steps on dry leaves. Slow, paused, then gone. My ears strained, my body frozen, my hand on the rifle beside me. I waited like that for what felt like hours. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under again. I woke at dawn to find the edge of the tent smeared with mud. A handprint, small, too small to be mine. Not a child's, but narrow, wiry. My heart pounded as I knelt there staring at it. The damp brown smudge where someone had touched the tent during the night. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave right then. But part of me was stubborn. I had driven all the way out here. I had told myself I'd stay at least 2 nights. So I convinced myself again that it was nothing. Maybe I brushed it without realizing. Maybe I'd panicked over nothing. I went out again that morning, hunting half-heartedly. But my mind was back at camp the whole time. Every sound in the woods felt sharper, closer. By midday, I gave up and turned back. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead. My pack was open. Not ripped, not dumped, but opened. Zippers halfway undone. Some food missing. My knife lay on the ground a few feet from where I had left it. Whoever had been here had gone through my things, taken only what they wanted, and left the rest. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. My chest felt hollow. My skin prickled as I shoved everything back into the bag. The fire pit was still cold from the night before. I didn't bother relighting it. I broke down the tent as fast as my hands could move. Every sound behind me felt like a footstep. Every shift of leaves a breath too close. When I finally had everything thrown into the truck bed, I jumped into the cab and slammed the locks down. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I started the engine. The dirt road out seemed longer than before, the trees pressing in on both sides like walls. Halfway down that track, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. Just a flash, a figure stepping out from the tree lean into the clearing I had just left. Thin, hunched, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look again. I drove until the dirt turned to gravel, gravel to pavement, and only when I hit the highway did my breath finally even out. I never went back to that place. Even now, years later, I can remember the shape of that handprint on the tent, the neat way my pack had been unzipped. Whoever was out there wasn't lost, wasn't desperate. They were patient, they were watching, and they wanted me to know it. That's what made me leave. Not the thought of being attacked, but the thought of someone silently circling me, studying me, waiting for the moment I stayed too long. I was 21 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Minnesota. It was 2014, and I had just finished my second year of college. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods for a while, testing myself without the noise of people around me. I packed light but careful, tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, some food, a hatchet, a hunting knife, and a basic first aid kit. I drove 6 hours from my apartment to a state forest that wasn't as popular as the others. Fewer families, fewer fishermen, fewer campers in general. That was part of the appeal. I parked my car at a gravel pull-off where the dirt road ended. From there, I had to hike 3 miles along a barely marked trail that led into thick pine and birch. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of the wind seemed softer under the tall trees. By the time I reached the clearing I had marked on my map, my shoulders were aching from the pack, but I felt good. The clearing was small, only about 30 feet across, with moss-covered rocks and a soft bed of pine needles. A stream ran close enough that I could hear the water trickling. Felt like the perfect spot. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up at the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. I laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some dead branches, and built a small fire pit with stones. As the sun lowered, I boiled water on the propane stove and ate a freeze-dried meal. The night came fast and heavy. With no streetlights or houses anywhere, the darkness pressed in like a wall. I sat by the small fire until the wood burned low, listening to the forest noises, crickets, frogs, the occasional splash from the stream. I remember feeling both at peace and uneasy at the same time, like the woods were too big and I was too small. The first night was fine. I woke up a couple times to adjust in the sleeping bag, but I didn't hear anything unusual. The second day, I hiked further along the stream, explored a ridge that gave me a wide view of the forest, and collected more firewood. The air smelled sharp, like pine sap and damp earth. When I came back to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. A stick, one I had left leaning against the tent, was on the ground a few feet away. I figured I must have knocked it over myself or the wind had shifted it. I didn't think much of it. That night, though, was different. I was lying in my tent after the fire had gone out, staring into the dark fabric above me, when I heard something, soft footsteps, maybe 30 feet away. It wasn't an animal running, not the quick rustle of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. It was slow, measured, almost like someone walking. My stomach tightened. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it could have been a branch falling, or maybe a porcupine dragging itself across the ground. Eventually, I fell asleep, though it was restless and shallow. The next morning, I checked around camp. Nothing was disturbed, no tracks I could see in the soil, but I couldn't shake the sound from my head. I carried my hatchet with me all day as I walked. The thought of someone else being out there crept into me. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the car. There weren't any cabins or hunting shacks marked on the map. Still, the forest was huge. People could be anywhere. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, I was cooking noodles on the stove when I noticed something else. Across the stream, on the opposite bank about 40 yards away, a tree had fresh cuts in the bark. Clean cuts, like from a knife or hatchet, strips of pale wood showing. They hadn't been there the day before. My mouth went dry. Someone had been there, close enough to see my camp, close enough to leave marks. I stared at those cuts for a long time before turning back to my stove. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. Every sound seemed louder, the snapping of branches, the wind pushing through the trees. At some point, I heard it again. The slow crunch of footsteps, closer this time, maybe just beyond the clearing. I lay frozen, gripping my hunting knife in the dark. My heartbeat was so loud it filled my ears. The steps stopped, then silence. I waited, eyes wide open, until I eventually drifted into a light, anxious sleep. The fourth morning, I woke up groggy and sore. My first thought was leaving. The trip had been meant for 5 nights, but the idea of staying any longer twisted my stomach. As I stepped out of the tent, my foot hit something. It was a small pile of stones, stacked neatly right by the flap of the tent. 5 stones, balanced on top of each other. They hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My skin went cold. Someone had walked into my camp while I slept, close enough to touch my tent, and left that there. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. The woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. As I shouldered my pack and started back toward the trail, I kept glancing behind me. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every few minutes I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I focused, it was gone. The hike back felt twice as long. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. When I finally saw the dirt road where I had parked, relief rushed through me. But then I noticed something that almost made me drop my pack. My car was there, but the driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. My throat tightened as I walked closer, gripping the hatchet in one hand. The inside of the car smelled faintly of cigarettes, though I didn't smoke. On the passenger seat, my map had been unfolded and spread out, a circle drawn in pen around the clearing where I had camped. I didn't wait. I threw my pack into the back, slammed the doors shut, and drove off fast, gravel spitting under the tires. The whole drive home, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind me. They never did. When I got back to my apartment, I checked every lock twice and barely slept for 2 nights. I never went back to that forest. Even now, years later, I think about it. Not the quiet stream or the smell of pine, but the footsteps in the dark, the stacked stones, the cuts in the tree, the open car door. Somebody had been out there with me, watching, moving closer each night. And the worst part is not knowing what they wanted or how long they had been following me before I even noticed. I was 23 in the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a trip out to the desert in northern New Mexico. I had been doing weekend camping trips for years, usually in the forests closer to home in Colorado, but I wanted something different. A friend had told me about a stretch of land near the Navajo Nation where you could set up a camp far from anyone. Nothing but dry plains, red rock formations, and scattered juniper trees. I had an old Toyota Tacoma with a camper shell on the back and a decent amount of gear, so I figured I'd be fine on my own for a few nights. The drive itself felt endless. The 2-lane highways narrowed into rough dirt roads, and the further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No gas stations, no farmhouses, no traffic. Just sun, wind, and sand. By the time I found a spot to park and hike out, the late afternoon light had already started to fade into that deep orange that deserts seem to hold on to forever. I carried my pack out maybe a mile from the truck, far enough to feel isolated but close enough that I could return if the weather turned. The first night was calm. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat staring up at the stars. The sky out there looked unreal, every inch dotted with white light. I remember feeling small in a good way, like I was out where humans didn't matter anymore. The silence was deep, only broken by the occasional rustle of the dry brush when the wind picked up. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and slept. It was the second night when things shifted. I had spent most of the day walking the ridges, exploring shallow arroyos, and just trying to soak up the emptiness. I found strange claw marks on some of the rocks, but I told myself it was just from mountain lions or coyotes. When the sun began to dip, I returned to my camp, sore and dusty. I made a small fire again, but the wind was stronger that night, blowing hard enough that sparks carried further than I liked. I let the flames die down and sat in the dark with only the glow of the coals. That was when I started to feel it, the sense that something was out there. It wasn't a sound at first. It was just a weight, like the way your gut tightens before a storm hits. My eyes kept darting to the tree line. The junipers stood there, twisted and low, but in the half-light they looked like crouched figures. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, uneven, crunching in the dry soil. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray cow, but the steps were too deliberate. They would come a few paces closer, then stop like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I sat frozen, gripping my small camping knife, staring into the dark. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. The silence pressed down so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I finally forced myself into the tent, zipped it tight, and lay with the knife in my hand. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little scrape of wind against the fabric sounded like fingers. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of breathing outside the tent. Not an animal snort or huff, human breathing. Shallow, slow, as if someone was crouched inches from me, listening. I didn't move. I barely even let myself blink. My chest hurt from holding my breath. Stayed there for what felt like forever. Then slowly, very slowly, the sound faded away. By morning, I convinced myself it had to have been the wind or my imagination. But when I stepped out of the tent, I saw the tracks. Bare feet, pressed deep into the sand and circling my camp. No shoes, no boots. Just bare human footprints, wider than mine and longer too. My stomach dropped. I packed my bag right then and there, ready to head back to the truck. But curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, made me stay one more night. I told myself I'd be fine if I built the fire bigger, kept my knife close, and didn't let paranoia get to me. That day, I stuck closer to camp, watching the landscape, listening for anything. Nothing came. The desert was still and empty. When darkness came, I set the fire high and sat with my back to the tent so I could see in every direction. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement near the ridge. A figure, tall and thin, walking on two legs. It stopped in the open, just outside the circle of firelight. I couldn't make out a face, only the outline of a body that looked wrong. The arms were too long, the posture slightly hunched, like it wasn't built to walk upright but was forcing itself to. I gripped the knife and stayed still. The figure just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. My mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking so bad I thought I'd drop the blade. Finally, it turned. It didn't walk away like a person would. It loped, half running, half stumbling, disappearing into the dark without a sound. I didn't sleep at all that night. At the first hint of dawn, I grabbed my gear and practically ran back to the truck. The footprints were there again, circling the camp. Bare feet, some pressed deep like someone had been crouching low. When I got to the truck, I slammed the doors and locked them. Even though I was in the middle of nowhere, driving out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure trailing me down the dirt road. My hands didn't stop shaking until I hit the highway hours later. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I stopped camping alone for years after that. I've told myself over and over it had to have been some drifter living out in the desert, someone messed up in the head, maybe trying to scare me off. But in the back of my mind, I know what I saw. The way it moved wasn't right, the way it watched me wasn't normal. I think about those bare footprints sometimes. Too big, too human, and too wrong to just be some stranger. Whatever it was out there, it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And I've never forgotten that.